A wealthy Korean mafia man, Park Jae-won, marries a beautiful black woman named Anita. Their marriage starts perfectly, but he loses interest after 1 year, becomes cold and starts an affair with a young Korean co-worker named Nuna, spending months in luxury hotels with her while Anita stays home alone and heartbroken. Unknown to him, Anita is diagnosed with lung cancer and battles it completely alone, too dignified to beg for his attention. As she nears death, she calls him 3 times just to hear his voice one last time. He sees every call and ignores them all while enjoying himself with his mistress. 2 days later, she dies, still wearing his old sweatshirt, her wedding ring still on her finger, her journal filled with forgiveness and love, not anger. When Jae-won finds out, he is completely destroyed. He ends the affair, fires Nuna, reads Anita's journal and breaks down completely. He spends the rest of his life visiting her grave, honoring her memory and regretting the call he never answered. The night Park Jae-won first saw Anita Osei, the entire room ceased to exist. She walked into the charity gala at the Grand Hyatt Seoul, wearing a burgundy silk dress that hugged every curve of her body, like it had been sewn onto her skin by angels. Her hair, long, wild, gloriously curly, cascaded over her shoulders like a crown that God himself had placed there. Her skin was deep and rich, the color of polished mahogany kissed by warm evening light, and when she smiled at something her friend whispered in her ear, Jae-won felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for years. He was not a man who felt things easily. At 32, Park Jae-won was one of the most feared and respected names in Seoul's underground world. The tattoos that crawled up both arms and crept along the side of his neck told stories that could make grown men lose sleep. A serpent coiled around his left forearm. A chrysanthemum bloomed across his right shoulder blade, petals reaching toward his spine. On his chest, over his heart, were Korean characters in bold ink: Namen Jaemuge, the weight of the one who remains. His father had that phrase tattooed on him too, before he died. It was a family legacy of pain dressed up as art. His empire was vast and complicated. On the surface, Park Enterprises was a legitimate conglomerate: luxury hotels, tech investments, real estate developments across Asia and Europe. Beneath the surface, it was something else entirely. Something that required men with guns standing at doorways and conversations that were never recorded. Something that powerful men spoke about in careful, abbreviated sentences and that lesser men didn't speak about at all. He had money that could drown small countries. He had power that made politicians nervous. He had a penthouse in Gangnam with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wine collection worth more than most people's homes. What he did not have was anyone to come home to. He crossed the room before his mind gave his legs permission. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life," he told her plainly. In English, standing beside her with a glass of champagne he hadn't touched. No game, no rehearsed line, just the raw, unfiltered truth of a man who had spent his whole life speaking in codes finally choosing honesty. Anita turned and looked at him. She took in the tailored black suit, the inked skin at his collar, the sharp jaw, the dark eyes that held something complicated and deep. She was not a woman who was easily rattled. She had her own world. She was a fine arts curator from Accra who had built a career on spotting beauty in things most people overlooked. She had learned to read people through their surfaces, and what she read in Park Jae-won was something she hadn't encountered before. A man of enormous power wearing his vulnerability like a second skin he didn't quite know how to take off. She smiled slowly. "You say that to everyone?" "I don't say much to anyone," he replied. She believed him. Somehow, she believed him completely. Their courtship was the kind that makes old women sigh and young women dream. He flew her to Jeju Island on a private jet for their third date, but it wasn't the jet that moved her. It was the fact that he had remembered, from a passing comment she made at the gala, that she had never seen the Haenyeo divers, the women of the sea, and that she had always wanted to. He arranged for a private introduction. He stood beside her at the rocky shore and watched her watch these women emerge from the water, breathless and triumphant, and he watched her face the way other people watch sunsets. He learned how to say, "You look like sunlight" in Chui because she mentioned once, casually, that her grandmother only spoke her mother tongue, and that whenever anyone made the effort she wept with joy. He sat through 4-hour gallery exhibitions without checking his phone because she was passionate about art and he was passionate about her. He held her hand in public without caring what his associates thought, even when eyebrows were raised and whispers moved like smoke through certain circles. In J1's world, softness was often interpreted as weakness. He did not care. She was worth every whisper. She, in turn, loved him without condition or performance. She made him jollof rice at midnight when he came home tense from meetings she was never fully told about. She traced his tattoos with her fingertip on quiet Sunday mornings and asked him what each one meant, and he told her. Really told her, in ways he had never spoken about to anyone. She knew about the chrysanthemum and what it meant in Korean tradition. She knew about the serpent that had been his initiation mark, the thing he carried with complicated pride and complicated shame. She never asked him to be less of what he was. She simply stood beside him and loved the whole complicated, dangerous, beautiful wreck of him. When he proposed, it was in her favorite museum in Paris at closing time, when the Louvre was entirely empty and the only light came from the art on the walls. He had arranged it through 6 weeks of planning and 3 different layers of private negotiation. He had studied which painting was her absolute favorite, a lesser-known piece by a Ghanaian artist whose work had been acquired by the museum in 2019, and he proposed in front of it. He got down on one knee with a ring that held a diamond the color of midnight surrounded by smaller stones in deep violet, and he said, voice quieter and more vulnerable than she had ever heard it, I don't know how to be soft, Anita. I was never taught. But with you I keep trying. And I want to keep trying for the rest of my life. Please let me. She cried. She said yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and pressed his lips to her knuckles and held her hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Their wedding was held in Santorini. 300 guests. White flowers tumbling from every archway. The Aegean Sea spread out behind them like blue silk. She walked toward him in a gown that made the entire crowd go breathless. Ivory lace with shoulders bare and a train that moved behind her like a slow tide. And when he saw her, Park Jae-won felt his eyes fill with tears. He quickly blinked away. Almost. But she saw. She always saw. And she smiled at him with such tenderness, such knowing, that he felt entirely understood for the first time in his adult life. Not managed. Not admired from a distance. Not feared. Simply known. The first year was extraordinary. They traveled constantly and laughed endlessly and argued passionately and made up even more passionately. He introduced her to his world slowly and carefully. She filled their home with art, with color, with the kind of warmth that a penthouse built for one man had never once known. She planted flowers on the rooftop terrace. Wild, extravagant, untidy flowers that his housekeeper didn't know how to maintain, and that Anita tended herself on Sunday mornings in an oversized shirt, with her curly hair pinned up and music playing from her phone. She played Afrobeats on Saturday mornings and made him dance badly, and he didn't care. He was happy. Genuinely, fully, unguardedly happy. And then, like a candle flame in a quiet room, something shifted. Nobody could point to the exact moment it began. That's the cruelest thing about indifference. It doesn't arrive with noise. It doesn't announce itself at the door or give you the courtesy of a reason. It simply seeps in, quiet as fog rolling off water in the early morning, until one day you look across the breakfast table and realize the person sitting there has been somewhere else for a very long time and you cannot remember precisely when they left. The first sign was the lateness. Jae-won had always worked long hours. She had known this from the beginning, but there was a difference between a man coming home at midnight smelling of stress and coffee, reaching for her hand as he settled into bed, and a man coming home at midnight radiating a distance so complete it might as well have been a physical wall. He stopped asking about her day. He stopped remembering the small things she mentioned in passing. He stopped laughing at her jokes, not because they were less funny, but because he had stopped listening closely enough to hear them. The phone calls she would once receive throughout the day. Small, unnecessary calls, just to hear her voice, just to say, I saw a restaurant we should try, or that artist you mentioned, I looked her up. Those calls simply stopped. Quietly, without announcement. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Women always notice first. But Anita was not a woman who panicked at the first sign of weather change. She understood that marriages had seasons. She understood that pressure and stress could make a person temporarily unreachable. She gave him space. She gave him time. She continued to be warm, to be present, to be the woman he had married. She kept making his coffee, 2 sugars, no milk, slightly too hot. She kept pressing his dress shirts because he liked the collars sharp and crisp. She kept waiting up for him, keeping a lamp on in the living room so he wouldn't come home to complete darkness. For months, she waited for the season to change. Didn't. Deepened. There were small cruelties that he likely didn't register as cruelties at all, which was perhaps the worst part. He canceled their anniversary dinner at the last moment for a meeting that his assistant could have handled. He forgot her birthday, not completely. He remembered at 10 in the evening and had flowers delivered. But the card that came with them had been written by his assistant and she could tell by the handwriting. He stopped complimenting her. She would dress carefully, take time with her hair, wear something beautiful and walk past him in the apartment to receive nothing. Not a word, not a glance, not even an absent-minded acknowledgement. She began to feel invisible. This was new and terrible. Anita had never in her life felt invisible. She was a woman of vivid presence. In any room, in any gathering, she was felt. People gravitated toward her warmth without knowing why. She had spent her adult life being seen, in the full and generous sense of the word. And now, in her own home, in the marriage she had built her future upon, she was becoming a ghost. She tried, in her quiet way, to reach him. She cooked his favorite meals and sat across from him and asked careful, gentle questions that left room for real answers. He gave short ones. She suggested weekends away, small trips, just the 2 of them. He was always too busy. She touched his arm in the evenings and he would not pull away. He was never cold enough for that, never cruel enough for that, but he didn't turn toward her either. He simply remained still under her hand, tolerating her touch the way a man tolerates something he no longer desires but hasn't found the words to refuse. She cried in the shower. Only there. Only where the water covered the sound. And then she would wash her face and walk back out and smile. Because she believed, still with the stubborn and irrational faith of a woman deeply in love, that this was temporary. That something had taken hold of him that was not permanent. That the man who had learned Chui phrases and proposed in the Louvre was still in there, somewhere, waiting to come back to himself. She didn't know about Nuna yet. She would not know for a long time. Her name was Nuna, and she worked in the executive division of Park Enterprises. She was 27, Korean, and startlingly beautiful in the way that a sharp knife is beautiful, precise, dangerous, designed to cut. She had large dark eyes that knew exactly how to look helpless and wide and full of admiration. She had trained herself for years to appeal to men like Park Jae-won, powerful, wealthy, tattooed kings who moved through the world expecting worship. She had watched men like him from a distance for most of her adult life and made a quiet study of them. She knew their weakness wasn't beautiful women. Men like Jae-won were surrounded by beautiful women and were largely immune to mere beauty. Their weakness was being understood, being admired without reservation, being allowed to be uncomplicated. A man carrying the weight of an empire needs somewhere to put it down. Nuna made herself into that place with expert deliberation. She was always available. She was always enthusiastic. She always had time, always had attention, always had a smile calibrated precisely to his mood. When he was stressed, she was soothing. When he was powerful, she was admiring. When he was tired, she was gentle. She was like a mirror that only showed him his best angles, and after months of feeling unseen at home, after months of the emotional work of a marriage that had grown complicated, the ease of it was intoxicating. He told himself it was nothing. Then he told himself it was just conversation. Then he told himself it was just dinner. Then he told himself it was just this once. He was wrong each time. And Nuna, watching each line fall and each excuse dissolve, felt nothing but satisfaction. She had chosen her target carefully and she had executed her strategy without error. She was not cruel about it. She told herself she wasn't cruel. She simply wanted what she wanted. And what she wanted was a man like him. And the opportunity had come to her doorstep and she had walked through without hesitation or backward glance. She did not think about Anita much. When she did, she rearranged her thoughts quickly. Nuna's apartment was on the 28th floor of a luxury tower in Mapo-gu. Modest compared to J1's penthouse but aspirational in every careful detail. She had decorated it herself. White walls, clean lines, everything in its exact place. The apartment of a woman who had been rehearsing for an upgraded life. The first time J1 visited, it was past midnight. He had told Anita he was at a business dinner. He had told himself he would stay an hour. He stayed until 4 in the morning and drove home through empty Seoul streets with his collar open and something heavy sitting in his chest that he refused to identify as guilt. He looked at his reflection in the elevator mirror when he arrived home. The apartment was quiet. A lamp was on in the living room. Anita had left it on for him. She always left it on for him. He stood in the living room doorway and looked at the lamp. And then he looked away and went to bed. By the 3rd month, he was lying to her about different things on different days and had stopped keeping track of the stories because he had stopped caring enough to maintain them carefully. This, perhaps more than anything else, was the real betrayal, not the affair itself, but the lazy carelessness with which he conducted it, the half-hearted deceptions that would have been obvious to any woman paying attention. Anita was paying attention. She just chose not to confirm what she suspected, because confirmation would require a conversation she wasn't ready to have. And having that conversation would make real something she was still hoping wasn't. So she stayed in the space between knowing and not knowing, which is the loneliest place in the world, and she kept the lamp on, and she kept his coffee the way he liked it, and she kept trying. The vacation to Bali was when something in her finally broke. Not loudly. Anita didn't break loudly. But she had been ironing a shirt of his one Thursday evening when her phone buzzed with a notification. A tagged photograph on a mutual acquaintance's social media. A group shot from a dinner in Gangnam. Jaewon was in it, suited and smiling in that rare, unguarded way he almost never allowed himself in public. He was at the far edge of the photograph. Beside him, not touching him, not doing anything suspicious at all, was a young Korean woman in a white dress. The way he was smiling. Anita knew that smile. She had spent a year collecting it, studying it, being the only person in the world he aimed it at. She set the iron down. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She put her phone in her pocket. She finished ironing the shirt with steady hands and hung it carefully in his wardrobe. That night she lay beside him and listened to him breathe, and she thought, I already know. She didn't say it. She didn't say anything. Instead, in the days that followed, she did something that surprised even herself. She became more loving, more deliberate, as though she could, through sheer force of devotion, remind him of what was real. She reached for him more. She made the effort more visible. She was, in hindsight, offering him every opportunity to choose her. He didn't take it. He chose Bali instead, and the woman in the white dress, and the version of himself that required nothing and risked nothing. The apartment after he left for what would become a 3-month absence felt different in ways that were hard to articulate. Not emptier, exactly. He had barely been present enough in recent months to generate a meaningful absence. It was more that the pretending was over, and without the pretending, the rooms became very honest about what they were. Quiet. Still. Belonging to one woman eating dinner at a table set for 2. Anita moved through the rooms. She watered her plants. She went to her gallery. She called her mother and spoke about everything except the truth. She had a small group of friends, Zara, a Senegalese architect who had been her closest friend since graduate school. Tabena, a Nigerian photographer based in Seoul who had been at their wedding. Misha, an American choreographer she'd met at an exhibition 3 years ago. And she saw them less and less, deflecting invitations with excuses that grew thinner over time. She couldn't bear the questions. Not because she didn't trust her friends. Because answering the questions out loud would make everything real in a way that she wasn't yet ready to survive. So she drew inward, and the ache in her chest, which had been growing quietly, unannounced, in the way that the worst things always approach, grew with her withdrawal in the dark without witnesses. The ache had started small. She first noticed it in September, 3 months after J1 had stopped coming home with any regularity. She had been lifting a box of art catalogs at the gallery when a sharp stitch caught her just below her left collarbone. Quick, decisive, like a fingernail pressed into skin. She gasped and set the box down and breathed through it, and it passed. She told herself it was muscle strain. She was moving heavy boxes. She needed to be more careful. But it came back. Not always sharp. Sometimes it was a dull, persistent pressure, like a stone sitting inside her chest that she couldn't dislodge. Sometimes it was breathlessness on a staircase she had climbed 100 times without trouble. Sometimes it was simply a heaviness that had no clear origin, that couldn't be entirely separated from the emotional weight she was already carrying. So she kept folding it into that category. I'm sad. I'm stressed. I'm lonely. That's all this is. She was brilliant at explaining away her own symptoms. She had learned this from her mother, who had raised 3 children alone after their father left and had trained herself never to be the weakest person in any room. You didn't stop. You didn't complain. You managed. By October, she had lost several kilograms without trying. Her clothes fit differently. Her face was a little sharper, her collarbones more visible. Zara noticed during a brief coffee meeting and said, "You look thin, Anita. Are you eating?" "I eat," Anita said, which was technically true but imprecisely so. By November, there were nights she couldn't sleep on her left side because of the pressure. There were mornings she woke already tired. There was a cough that came and went, dry and odd and not connected to any cold. She made the appointment on a Tuesday, more to silence the quiet alarm bell in the back of her mind than because she genuinely believed something was wrong. She sat in the waiting room of Asen Medical Center's oncology wing. She had been referred there by her GP, casually, for precautionary imaging, she had told herself. In her cream trench coat with her bag on her lap and her hair pinned up and her face entirely composed. She looked like a woman waiting for a flight. Dr. Kim came out himself to meet her. He had been her doctor for 5 years. He had seen her for a sprained wrist and a sinus infection and an annual physical and nothing more serious than that. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades delivering news that changed lives. She had always liked him. The fact that he came out himself, rather than sending a nurse, told her something before he said a word. "Where is your husband, Anita?" he asked, leading her gently toward his office. "We would normally recommend." "He's on a business trip," she said. The lie was immediate and clean. "Please, just tell me." He sat across from her. He held her file in his hands and he looked at her with the careful steadiness of a man choosing his words. Stage 3. Left lung. The imaging was unambiguous. The cells were aggressive. There was treatment available, chemotherapy, radiation, potentially surgery depending on response. But the window was not unlimited, the road would be hard, and she needed to begin as soon as possible. She listened to every word. Her face did not change. She asked 2 questions. What is the realistic timeline without treatment? And what happens first? He answered both. She thanked him. She shook his hand. The handshake was steady. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood inside the small mirrored box as it descended 32 floors, and she looked at herself in the mirror and thought of nothing at all. Her mind had gone perfectly white, the way a page looks before a single word is written on it. She walked to her car. She sat in it in the underground parking structure for 45 minutes without starting the engine. Above her, the city continued, horns and voices and the mundane persistence of ordinary life. And down here she sat in the specific silence of a woman whose world had just been reclassified. He doesn't know, she thought. He is somewhere with her, in some hotel with its clean sheets and its room service trays, and he doesn't know. He is laughing at something. He is happy, whatever that means to him now. And he doesn't know. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call him. Not that day. That day was hers alone, and she needed to carry it by herself for a little while before deciding what to do with it. She drove home through Seoul as the afternoon light turned gold and long and the city threw shadows across every surface, and she looked at all of it. The bridges, the river, the towers, the street vendors and the children and the old men on benches, with the particular attention of someone who has just been reminded that looking is a gift. That night, she cried on the floor of the bathroom for a very long time. Not for herself entirely. She cried for her mother, who would be devastated. She cried for her gallery, the work half finished and the exhibitions half planned. She cried for the rooftop flowers that someone else would have to learn to tend. She cried for the version of her life that had existed before tonight, Even the hard version, even the lonely version, even the lying awake while her husband was absent version, because it was still life and life was still worth crying for. And yes, she cried for him. She cried for the man who had stood in Paris on one knee and asked to keep trying. She cried for the gap between who he had been and who he had become, and for the mystery of how a person could cross that distance without appearing to notice the journey. She cried because she loved him and she was going to die, and he didn't know either of those things were happening simultaneously. Then she washed her face. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. She began chemotherapy on the 14th of November. She arranged everything herself, the appointments, the transport, the supplementary medications, the dietary adjustments. She hired a private nurse named Ms. O, a woman in her 50s with a practical manner and warm eyes, who came 3 days a week and stayed overnight on the bad days. She paid her generously and asked only 2 things: complete discretion and complete honesty. Ms. O gave her both. The first round of chemo was brutal in the specific way that treatment is brutal. Not dramatic, not like the movies, but grinding and exhausting and unglamorous. There were days she couldn't eat. Days she spent mostly in bed, listening to the city outside the window. Days when every part of her body felt like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. She lost more weight. There were mornings she looked in the mirror and had to work harder to recognize the woman looking back, which was disorienting in a way that was separate from all the other disorientation. But she kept going. She kept going because she was Anita, and Anita kept going. She continued going to the gallery on her good days, Tuesdays and Thursdays, when her energy was highest. Her colleagues noticed her weight loss with careful concern, and she told them it was a digestive issue, being managed, nothing serious. She curated 2 small exhibitions during these months that her colleagues later said were among the most beautiful work she had ever done. This did not surprise her. Proximity to endings has a way of clarifying what is important. She called her mother every Wednesday. She did not mention the illness. Her mother had a weak heart and had recently recovered from a minor stroke, and Anita had made a private decision, in that underground parking garage on the evening of her diagnosis, that she would not burden her mother with this unless it became absolutely necessary. Her mother had spent too many years worrying. She deserved these weeks of ordinary Wednesday phone calls about weather and food and small joys. "You sound tired, my daughter," her mother said on a call in early December.
"Iam tired, Mama Anita admitted.
"But I'm okay. Where is J1? Is he helping you?" A pause. Brief managed. "He's very busy. You know how he is." Her mother made a sound that contained volumes but restrained itself to silence. "You tell that man," she said finally, "that a busy man who comes home to an empty house will one day find it empty for good." Anita closed her eyes. "Yes, Mama." She thought about telling him many times. She would reach for her phone with the specific intention of calling him, and then she would sit with the phone in her hand and think about what would happen. He would come home, perhaps, out of obligation, out of guilt. He would sit across from her in their apartment with that careful, distant face she had grown to know so well, and he would say the right things in the wrong tone, and she would spend whatever time she had left watching him perform concern while longing to be elsewhere. She didn't want that. She wanted him to want to be there. She wanted him to come home because he couldn't bear not to, not because she had handed him a diagnosis that made leaving feel unconscionable. So she stayed quiet. She carried it. She carried it the way she carried everything. Steadily, privately, with her back straight and her face composed. There were nights when the carrying became almost impossible. Nights when the pain was loud and Ms. O was asleep in the guest room, and the apartment was very quiet and very large, and Anita lay in the bed that had once held 2 people and felt the weight of everything she was managing alone. On those nights she would reach across to his side of the bed and press her hand flat against the cold sheets and breathe. She didn't know what she was reaching for. She just needed, sometimes, to remind herself that he had been real, that the good years had been real, that she hadn't invented the man who had danced in her kitchen and learned her grandmother's language. The ring on her finger helped. She never took it off. Even on the worst nights, even when her fingers were thin and the ring sat a little loosely on them now, she kept it. It was not stubbornness. It was not hope. It was simply that the ring was the most honest object in her life. It said, "I was loved, once, completely," and that was a true sentence, and true sentences were precious. Meanwhile, in Tokyo and Bali and Singapore and everywhere else that wasn't home, Park Jae-won was building a life with someone who didn't love him. He didn't know that yet. He would not know it for a long time. He was experiencing what a man experiences when he has traded complexity for ease. A specific temporary lightness, like dropping a heavy bag mid-journey. Feels like freedom. Feels like relief. It is, in fact, simply postponement. The weight doesn't disappear. It waits. Nuna was good at being what he needed in the short term. She was funny when he needed distraction, quiet when he needed space, available at all hours without complaint. She had moved, gradually and expertly, from being a woman he visited to being a presence that structured his days. She made his coffee in the mornings. She organized his evenings. She referred to events in the plural. We should, she said. We could. When we go. He noticed this and did not correct it. Not because he wanted her permanence, but because correcting it required more emotional energy than he currently had, and it was easier to let it stand. He had stopped thinking about Anita daily. This happened slowly, not deliberately. His mind didn't wipe her away so much as she gradually occupied less of his foreground. She moved to the periphery. The marriage was something he thought of with vague discomfort that he had learned to sidestep. He would deal with it. Later. When he was ready. When the right moment came. The right moment, of course, did not come. Moments never do when you're waiting for them to arrive on their own. December in Seoul arrived the way it always did. Sudden, decisive. The city trading its autumn bronze for steel-gray skies and breath visible in cold air. The Han River stiffened at its edges. The streets filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts from corner vendors. Christmas lights appeared on every major street in Myeongdong and Insadong, blinking and festive and indifferent to individual sorrow. In the penthouse above Gangnam, Anita sat at the kitchen table on a quiet Tuesday morning with a cup of tea she had allowed to go cold and looked out at the city below. Snow was threatening, not yet falling, but present in the sky as a gray, heavy promise. She was wearing his old university sweatshirt, navy blue, worn thin at the elbows. She had found it at the back of a wardrobe months ago and had begun wearing it on cold mornings because it was warm and because she was past the point of managing her own sentimentality. She had lost, by now, nearly 12 kilograms. She had cut her hair. Not dramatically, not all of it. But the long, abundant curls that Jae-won had loved, that she had loved, had been thinning from the treatment, and one afternoon she had made the decision to cut them to her shoulders rather than watch them disappear by degrees. Zara had come over and done it herself with scissors and a steady hand and had not commented on the thinness of what she held. Afterward, she had held Anita's face in her hands and looked at her for a long time. Anita, don't. Please. Zara had let it go. But she hadn't left until late that night, and she had come back 2 days later with food and had said nothing that required a real answer. This was the best kind of friendship. The kind that understood the boundaries of what a person could bear to explain. She had a bad week in the middle of December. The second round of chemotherapy had been harder than the first, which the doctors had warned her was possible. She spent 4 days largely in bed, in the reliable care of Ms. O, eating very little, sleeping in long, uncomfortable stretches broken by pain that the medication addressed but didn't entirely resolve. On the third day she called her gallery and asked them to postpone an exhibition she had been planning for February. She did this in a steady voice and spent 20 minutes afterward sitting very still, absorbing the reality of what she had just done. She was beginning to postpone her life. This was the first real acknowledgement to herself, not to the doctor, not to Ms. O, not to Zara, that things were moving in a direction she could no longer fully manage with willpower and routine. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell to get notified when a new story comes up. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from.